Dr. Harrison Vance snatched the emergency trauma shears directly out of my hand and mocked my paramedic uniform in front of 10 people, having no idea that these very hands had once stitched an open aorta back together in the middle of a firefight in Kabul. It was 3:14 a.m. on a stifling Tuesday morning in Norfolk, Virginia. The air in Trauma Bay 2 at Mercy General Hospital smelled of cheap disinfectant and venous blood. To the rest of the staff, I was just Nora Blake, a quiet, 31-year-old paramedic wearing a dark blue uniform worn at the elbows and broken-in combat boots. A woman who rarely raised her voice. They thought I was just another exhausted first responder, someone who drove the ambulance through rain-slicked streets and handed off the wounded at the doors so the real doctors could do the important work. Nobody in that building had any idea that beneath my rescue uniform, I carried scars from wars most of those doctors had only seen in movies. They didn't know that I had once been a medical captain and trauma surgeon for the United States Navy Special Forces. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, please subscribe to Emergency Heroes Stories, and take a moment to tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening to this story from right now. The fluorescent light above the bay flickered with an annoying buzz. Working for Norfolk's emergency medical service was my way of continuing to save lives, without facing the suffocating bureaucracy and destructive ego games that had shattered my military career 3 years ago. I wasn't looking for praise. I never asked for promotions. And I parked my unit in the furthest corner of the bay where the cameras couldn't reach. Beside me stood Leo Miller, my 24-year-old ambulance partner. Leo was dedicated, but his fingers still trembled when blood splattered across the dashboard. He looked at me with respect, knowing only that I had some vague prior experience in field medicine. "Nora, the patient's pulse started fluctuating," Leo said, adjusting the oxygen flow on the gurney. His blood pressure dropped to 90/60. The tension pneumothorax you decompressed on the highway is holding, but his breathing sounds heavy. "Keep your composure, Leo," I replied softly. We stabilized the left lung collapse with the relief needle at the crash site. His pulse is dropping because there's a subtle compression inside his chest cavity. His heart is fighting against fluid accumulation. The patient was Thomas Cole, a 28-year-old former Army specialist. He had survived a rollover crash on the coastal highway after his sedan was broadsided by a semi-truck. When we arrived, he was pinned inside the wreckage, suffocating. In less than 3 minutes, in the dark under a cold drizzle, I had performed an emergency needle thoracostomy, opening a relief pathway for trapped air and preventing his left lung from collapsing entirely. We pushed through the doors of Trauma Bay 2. The room was chaotic, filled with residents, nurses rushing with IV bags, and the chirping of cardiac monitors. Standing at the center was Dr. Harrison Vance, 45 years old, Chief of Emergency Medicine. Harrison was the living definition of institutional arrogance. He wore a tailored suit under his spotless lab coat, hair slicked back, and a gold watch catching the ceiling lights. He was infamous for his ruthless obsession with cost-cutting metrics, his vanity, and the cruel way he humiliated staff. "What do we have here?" Harrison asked, stepping up without looking the patient in the eye. He checked his watch. "A basic traffic accident? Why the delay on the handoff? Transport crew. Male patient, 28 years old, blunt chest trauma," Leo began. He presented with clear signs of tension pneumothorax at the scene. "Paramedic Blake executed an emergency needle decompression and—" "Stop talking," Harrison interrupted, raising a gloved hand with contempt. "I don't need a dramatic story written by ambulance drivers. You paramedics love to pretend you're starring in an action movie just because you know how to use trauma shears." Harrison stepped forward and abruptly yanked the shears and clipboard out of my hands, slamming them against the supply cart with a loud clatter. "Leave the actual medicine to people who spent 8 years in medical school," Harrison said, smirking at 2 residents nearby. "Your job ends at the ambulance doors. Go clean out your rig and let the real professionals handle the patient." Leo took a step back, his face flushing red. I remained completely motionless, keeping my eyes locked onto Harrison's face, my expression unreadable. "Dr. Vance," I said quietly, "this patient requires an immediate bedside ultrasound. His heart sounds are distinctly muffled, and his right jugular vein is engorging. Harrison let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head. Are you diagnosing heart conditions through psychic intuition now, Paramedic Blake? He sneered. This is a simple pulmonary contusion. I will order a chest x-ray and a mild sedative to calm the boy down. If you administer a sedative right now, his blood pressure will collapse to 0 in under 30 seconds, I stated, taking a step forward. The sedative will relax the accessory respiratory muscles, maintaining his venous return. He is developing an early pericardial tamponade from the steering wheel impact. The two young residents looked at each other, stunned by the exact medical terminology coming out of a paramedic's mouth. Harrison noticed his students' reactions, his face flushing a dark crimson. Enough, Harrison barked, stepping directly into my personal space. Who do you think you are to question my clinical judgment inside my own hospital? You are a paramedic, a technician who drives an emergency vehicle. If you utter another word, I will call your supervisor this second and ensure your certification is permanently revoked for insubordination. At that exact second, Thomas Cole's cardiac monitor exploded into a high-pitched alarm. His heart rate spiked to 140 beats per minute, while his blood pressure line plummeted down to 60/30. The young veteran began to thrash weakly, suffocating. He's entering obstructive shock, one of the residents yelled. Dr. Vance, should we prep for immediate intubation? Harrison froze, his hands trembling slightly. He grabbed a laryngoscope, preparing to force an endotracheal tube down the patient's throat, a move that would increase intrathoracic pressure and kill the young man instantly. Without asking for permission, I moved in. My hands moved with surgical speed and precision. I slid my index finger across the patient's chest, locating the exact site where the relief catheter valve I had placed on the highway had become clogged by a small blood clot. With one swift twist, I rotated the catheter hub and cleared the blockage using a sterile needle tip from my pocket. A loud hiss of pressurized air and trapped blood sprayed out of the chest cavity, releasing the immense pressure crushing Thomas Cole's heart. Instantly, the cardiac monitor stabilized. His blood pressure shot back up to 110/70. Thomas drew in a deep gasp of air, natural color returning to his face. Harrison staggered back 2 steps, his mouth hanging open, the laryngoscope nearly slipping from his fingers. The residents stared at my hands in absolute shock. Trapped air was building in the pleural space due to a minor clot in the relief valve, I said calmly. His heart has room to pump again. You can order that ultrasound and place a formal chest tube now, doctor. Your patient is stable. Harrison stood there, unable to find his voice. The contrast between his panic and my surgical composure was devastating. His face was a mask of deep humiliation and burning hatred. He realized he had been completely outplayed in front of his staff by the woman he had just tried to destroy. You have crossed a fatal line, Paramedic Blake, Harrison rasped out, his voice shaking with fury. You executed an unauthorized procedure without direct medical supervision. I am going straight to the hospital board, and I will personally ensure you never work on an ambulance in this state again. Before I could answer him, the ceiling of the hospital seemed to vibrate with a deep tremor. 3 high-decibel electronic blasts echoed through the emergency speakers across the entire facility, a sound reserved strictly for military mass casualty events or Tier 1 security protocols. Beep, beep, beep. Code black in the main ambulance bay. All Level 1 trauma personnel report immediately. Through the frosted glass windows, blinding strobes of blue and red emergency lights illuminated the rain-slicked pavement outside. The deafening roar of heavy military engines and sirens tore through the night air. 4 blacked-out armored SUVs slammed their brakes in the ambulance bay, followed by 2 Navy police transport units. Men in dark tactical gear, carrying short-barreled carbines, swarmed out of the vehicles, establishing an armed security perimeter in under 10 seconds. The double glass doors were shoved open as 2 Navy SEALs cleared the threshold. Right behind them, a military medical team rushed forward, pushing a heavy tactical transport gurney surrounded by high-ranking Navy flag officers. Lying on the gurney, wrapped in thermal trauma blankets with his dress uniform torn and soaked in dark arterial blood, was Admiral Robert Sterling, one of the highest-ranking commanders in the United States Navy. His face was gray, His breathing was agonic, and his portable cardiac monitor showed he was seconds away from an irreversible cardiac arrest. Harrison's eyes widened in shock, his rage toward me forgotten instantly as he saw the massive political opportunity standing in front of him. He smoothed down his lab coat and rushed toward the doors to take control of the scene. I stood quietly at the center of Trauma Bay 2, watching through the glass. As my eyes locked onto the blood-soaked face of Admiral Robert Sterling, a sharp, familiar tightness seized my chest. I knew that face. I knew that man. And I knew that the storm about to hit this hospital was going to tear my carefully hidden world wide open. Chaos consumed the lobby of Mercy General Hospital the second the double-glass doors were shoved open by armed Navy SEALs. The sharp thud of combat boots against the floor mixed with the booming echo of tactical commands. The atmosphere inside the trauma bay transformed instantly into an active military emergency zone. Harrison straightened his lab coat with a twitch of his hands, his eyes bulging with greed. To a man obsessed with prestige, the arrival of a critically wounded 4-star Admiral represented the pinnacle of his career. He forgot his threat to revoke my certification and rushed toward the entrance, desperate to project an aura of total authority. "Clear a path!" Harrison bellowed, shoving 2 ER nurses out of the way. "I am Dr. Harrison Vance, Surgical Director of Emergency Medicine. Bring the gurney into Trauma Bay 1 immediately." The Navy captain leading the escort didn't even slow his stride. He blew past Harrison as if the doctor were invisible, keeping his gaze locked on the heavy transport gurney. "Trauma Bay 1 isn't going to cut it," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the roar of sirens outside. Admiral Robert Sterling suffered a catastrophic vascular collapse. He needs an immediate exploratory thoracotomy. Where is your primary surgical suite? Harrison swallowed hard, startled by the officer's fierce tone, but quickly recovered his arrogant composure. "The main surgical suite is on the 8th floor," Harrison answered, stepping in front to lead the group. "We will use the emergency elevator in the south wing. I will personally direct the procedure myself." The gurney brushed past me. Through the blood-soaked drapes, I caught a clear look at Admiral Sterling's face. He was 72 years old, with silver hair and sharp facial features that I recognized instantly from old command manuals. His skin was an ashen gray, slick with cold sweat. His dress uniform jacket had been cut open, revealing a thick pressure dressing over his left clavicular region completely saturated with bright arterial blood. The portable monitor attached to the gurney chirped erratically. His heart rate was plunging rapidly, 42 beats per minute, while his blood pressure plummeted to levels barely compatible with life. He was entering profound circulatory collapse. Harrison grabbed the manual resuscitation bag and began squeezing it with violent force, a desperate maneuver that was increasing the patient's intrathoracic pressure and choking his heart further. "Get the rapid infuser line connected," Harrison shouted, looking around. "Where is my surgical support crew?" I looked toward the supply counter where my partner, Leo Miller, was repacking our rescue gear. I knew with absolute certainty that in the Admiral's current state, any 60-second delay would be fatal. But even more than that, I knew that injury. I had repaired dozens of identical traumatic lacerations in forward operating bunkers across Afghanistan. Without a second thought, I grabbed our ambulance's high-complexity surgical trauma kit, a heavy bag that I kept stocked with vascular cannulas, chest seals, heavy-gauge decompression needles, and sterile scalpels. "Leo, stay with the motor vehicle crash patient and ensure the chest tube is secured," I commanded my partner, slinging the heavy strap over my shoulder. "Nora, are you going with them?" Leo asked, his face pale with panic. "Doctor, Vance said he was calling the police on you. He can call whoever he wants," I replied coldly. "That man on the gurney isn't going to survive if his life depends on Harrison's vanity." I fell into step behind the military escort as they charged down the central hallway toward the south wing elevator bank. Elevator number 3, the largest carriage in the building, was standing open, held by a maintenance worker awaiting the emergency override code. "Get in! Everyone in!" the Navy captain ordered, shoving the gurney into the steel carriage. Inside the elevator, the space was wide, but the presence of so many armed personnel made the air feel stiflingly dense. Harrison boarded first, positioning himself at the head of the bed. Immediately behind him came 2 armed Navy SEALs, the senior ER nurse holding the IV pole, and Commander Marcus, the Admiral's personal security chief, a 40-year-old man with razor-sharp eyes and an intimidating posture. I slipped into the carriage at the very last second, backing against the side wall with my heavy trauma bag rested against my boot. Harrison spotted me, his face flushing a dark, furious purple. "What in God's name do you think you're doing in here, paramedic?" Harrison roared, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "Get out of this elevator immediately. This is a high-security military transfer. You have zero authorization to be in this space." "There is no time for an administrative argument, Doctor," I replied, keeping my voice flat and steady. "The Admiral is suffering from severe fluid overload in his pericardial sac, and his central line is losing pressure. You are going to need trained hands the second his pulse vanishes on the way up." "I am a board-certified trauma surgeon," Harrison screamed, turning to Commander Marcus. "Commander, throw this woman out. She is an insubordinate paramedic who illegally tampered with a patient in my bay 10 minutes ago. She is actively endangering the Admiral's life." Commander Marcus turned his sharp eyes onto me. He evaluated my grounded posture, my steady, unblinking gaze, and the professional way I held the heavy trauma kit. Before the officer could make a decision, the heavy steel elevator doors slammed shut with a deep, mechanical clang. The 8th floor button illuminated in bright blue. The elevator gave a heavy tug and began its rapid ascent up the dark shaft. Bzzzt. The low hum of the electric motor pushed us upward through the concrete walls. Floor 2, Floor 3, Floor 4. It was at that exact microsecond that disaster struck. A deafening metallic snap, sounding like a heavy artillery shell firing inside the shaft, echoed through the steel cables. The fluorescent lights overhead cut out instantly, plunging the entire carriage into pitch-black darkness. Before anyone could scream, the elevator dropped into a terrifying freefall. Everyone's stomachs slammed into their throats. The wind howled through the cracks of the steel doors as the cab plummeted 2 full stories through the dark void at a neck-breaking speed. The sound of snapping steel cables contorting against the pulleys thundered through the shaft. The nurse let out a piercing shriek. Harrison lost his balance entirely, crashing to his knees onto the hard vinyl floor, dropping the resuscitation bag in the dark. The Navy SEALs slammed hard against the metal walls. With survival instincts forged through years of military combat training, I bent my knees and lowered my center of gravity, grabbing the steel handrail along the side wall with my left hand, while using my right arm to shield the gurney from flipping over. Bang! The emergency mechanical brakes bit into the steel guide rails with a brutal force. The carriage jerked to a sudden, bone-shattering halt, violently shaking between the 4th and 5th floors. The impact was so severe that fine concrete dust rained down on us in the dark. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the ragged gasps of the people trapped inside the steel box. "Jesus Christ!" one of the SEALs cursed, struggling to regain his footing in the dark. What the hell was that? "Everyone stay calm," Commander Marcus commanded, his voice razor-sharp. "Is anyone injured?" The dim, amber emergency light on the control panel flickered twice and clicked on, operating at a pathetic 10% capacity. The faint yellow beam was so weak we could barely discern each other's faces, casting long shadows across the steel walls. Harrison was huddled on the floor, pale as a corpse. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't even push himself up. His tailored suit was rumpled, and cold sweat poured down his forehead. The elevator fell, Harrison stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. "We're trapped in the shaft. Someone call maintenance. Get these doors open." He began frantically pounding his fists against the locked steel doors in an absolute display of panic. "Doctor, pull yourself together," Commander Marcus barked, grabbing Harrison by his collar and yanking him back. "Pounding on the steel isn't going to start the motors. We have a 4-star Admiral bleeding out on this bed." I stepped toward the gurney immediately, ignoring the subtle sway of the suspended elevator cab. The dim emergency light barely illuminated Admiral Sterling's chest. The violent impact of the mechanical brake lock had caused a catastrophic secondary trauma inside the Admiral's body. The portable monitor, running on its internal battery, began to scream in a continuous, high-decibel pitch. The cardiac rhythm line contorted into a rapid sequence of erratic spasms before flattening out completely into a straight line. "He's flatlined," the nurse screamed, pressing her hands over her mouth. "The Admiral is in full cardiac arrest." At that exact microsecond, a thick, dark arterial surge erupted from beneath the pressure dressing on the Admiral's chest. The trapped blood under immense pressure had torn clean through the skin sutures, and a heavy surging geyser of blood began pumping out of the wound, flooding the gurney drapes and pooling directly onto the vinyl floor of the elevator. The sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood filled the cramped space in seconds, suffocating the thin air. Harrison stared at the dark pool of blood spreading around his shoes and at the flatline display. His panic was absolute. His hands trembled so violently he couldn't even grip the oxygen tubing. The horror of being trapped in a dark elevator shaft, combined with the sight of an admiral dying under his watch, completely shattered his arrogant facade. He's having a massive internal hemorrhage," Harrison stammered, backing away until his spine hit the cold steel wall. "Without a surgical suite, without proper lighting, without cautery units, there is nothing we can do. He's going to die right here on the floor." Commander Marcus unclipped a high-lumen tactical flashlight from his vest, snapping it on and shining the brilliant beam of white light directly onto the Admiral's bloody, exposed chest. Admiral Robert Sterling was clinically dead. No pulse, no breathing, and bleeding out inside a dark elevator stuck between two floors. I stepped directly into the beam of white light, looked past the trembling doctor, and locked my eyes onto Commander Marcus. "He isn't dying in this elevator," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, quiet authority that froze the entire room. "He just needs someone who knows how to operate in the dark." The beam of white light from Commander Marcus's tactical flashlight cut through the murky, dim air of the stalled elevator cab, illuminating the pooling arterial blood around our boots. The portable monitor's flatline tone droned on, a single, unyielding pitch of death that echoed off the cold steel walls. Harrison was pressed against the corner, his knees trembling, his hands dripping with sweat and blood. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic as he stared at the flatline. "Are you insane?" Harrison shrieked, his voice cracking into a desperate whimper. "You're a paramedic. You cannot touch a 4-star admiral with a blade or an invasive needle. He's in cardiac arrest. The protocol demands immediate CPR and waiting for the fire department extraction team. If I perform chest compressions on a patient with acute pericardial tamponade and an open arterial tear, I will pump his remaining blood volume straight into his chest cavity," I said, my voice flat, cold, and utterly steady. "He will be dead in 40 seconds. I unzipped my heavy trauma bag with a smooth, practiced pull. The metallic teeth of the zipper sounded like a rifle bolt sliding into place in the quiet elevator cab. "Commander Marcus," I said, looking up into the eyes of the Navy security chief. "Hold that flashlight right at his subxiphoid space, just below his breastbone. Do not let that beam flicker by a single millimeter. You touch him with an invasive tool and I'll have you arrested for murder," Harrison screamed, taking an unstable step forward, his hand reaching out to grab my shoulder. "I am the attending surgical director here. I forbid you." Before Harrison's hand could touch my uniform, Commander Marcus shifted his weight and slammed his forearm against Harrison's chest, shoving the doctor back into the steel wall with a heavy thud. "Shut your mouth, doctor," Marcus growled, his voice dropping into a lethal, terrifying register that froze Harrison in place. "You're shaking like a leaf, and your patient is dead. Let her work." The 2 armed Navy SEALs took up positions on either side of the gurney, using their bodies to shield the space and stabilize the bed against the subtle, terrifying swaying of the suspended elevator. "What do you need, medic?" Marcus asked, lowering his stance and focusing the bright white beam of light directly onto the Admiral's bloody chest. "I need total silence," I replied, pulling a pair of sterile surgical gloves from my kit and pulling them onto my hands with 2 sharp, loud snaps. "And I need everyone to hold their breath." I reached into the bag and pulled out a 3-inch 14-gauge spinal needle attached to a 50-milliliter syringe, the heavy, specialized equipment I kept in my personal kit for field trauma emergencies. There were no ultrasound monitors. There were no digital imaging screens. There was no clean, sterile field or overhead surgical array. There was only the dim, amber glow of the elevator panel, the harsh beam of a tactical flashlight, and the smell of fresh blood filling the cramped space. I leaned over Admiral Robert Sterling's lifeless body. My eyes closed for a fraction of a second, letting 3 years of civilian paramedic life melt away. My mind shifted into the cold, crystalline focus of a Navy Special Forces trauma surgeon, working in a blackout bunker under mortar fire. I placed the index and middle fingers of my left hand directly onto the lower tip of the Admiral's sternum, feeling through the slick, warm blood for the anatomical landmarks. I mapped the ribcage by touch alone, calculating the angle, the depth, and the trajectory required to reach the pericardial sac without puncturing the heart muscle itself. "He has no pulse, Nora," the nurse whispered from the corner, her hands trembling as she held the IV bag. "0 blood pressure." "I know," I said softly. I positioned the tip of the long needle at a 45-degree angle just beneath the xiphoid process, aiming precisely toward his left shoulder. Harrison gasped in horror from the wall. "She's going in blind. She's going to spear his coronary artery." I ignored him entirely. My entire universe narrowed down to the sensation in my right thumb and index finger holding the syringe. In field surgery, when you operate without sight, your fingertips become your eyes. You feel the subtle density changes of the tissue, the resistance of the skin, the soft yield of the muscle, the tough, fibrous membrane of the pericardium. I pushed the needle forward into his chest. 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters. The needle met a sudden, dense resistance. The fibrous wall of the fluid-gorged pericardial sac, stretched to its absolute limit by trapped, pressurized blood that was crushing the Admiral's heart like a vice. I applied a firm, micro-calculated pressure. Pop. A subtle, tactile give echoed through the needle shaft directly into my fingers. I immediately pulled back on the syringe plunger. Instantly, dark, thick, non-clotting venous blood rushed up into the clear plastic cylinder of the syringe, driven by immense internal pressure. 10 milliliters, 20, 30, 40, 50. I closed the stopcock, detached the full syringe, squirted the dark blood onto the floor of the elevator, reattached the syringe, and pulled back again. "It's dark, deoxygenated blood trapped around the heart," I said calmly, drawing another 50 milliliters out of his chest. His pericardium was completely choked. The heart had no physical space to expand or pump. As the second syringe filled with blood, relieving the crushing pressure inside his chest, the flatline tone on the portable monitor suddenly broke. Beep. Beep. A jagged, erratic electrical spike flickered across the small digital screen. "We have electrical activity," the nurse gasped, stepping closer to the bed. "V-fib. He's trying to throw a rhythm. He doesn't need a shock. He needs volume and oxygen," I said, drawing a third full syringe of blood, 150 milliliters total, out of the pericardial sac. As the last drops of trapped blood cleared from around the heart muscle, the Admiral's chest suddenly heaved beneath my hands. Thump, 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 thump. A deep, powerful, bounding pulse surged through the Admiral's carotid artery beneath my left fingers. On the portable monitor, the chaotic spikes smoothed out into a strong, rhythmic sinus bradycardia. 60 beats per minute. The digital blood pressure readout flashed, recalibrating rapidly. 84/50, 92/60, 108/70. The Admiral pulled in a sudden, deep, shuddering gasp of air, his chest rising high against the thermal drapes. "Holy shit," one of the Navy SEALs breathed out, staring at the monitor in absolute disbelief. She brought him back. Commander Marcus stared at the monitor, then looked up at my face, his sharp eyes filled with a profound, stunned awe. "His pulse is solid. You did that completely blindly." Harrison stumbled forward from the wall, his mouth hanging wide open, his eyes darting frantically between the syringe in my hand, the blood on the floor, and the stable monitor numbers. That's statistically impossible," Harrison stammered, his voice trembling violently. "A blind pericardiocentesis in a moving, unsterile elevator cab, without a guided echo. You should have killed him." "I didn't kill him because I know where the heart sits when a man is dying, Doctor," I said, locking the drain line in place with a sterile clamp and securing it to the Admiral's chest with surgical tape. Unlike you, I don't need an ultrasound machine to tell me where to put my hands. Harrison's face flushed with a mixture of intense humiliation and bitter, poisonous rage. He looked at the two SEALs, then at Commander Marcus, realizing that every person in that elevator had just witnessed his complete mental collapse, while a paramedic performed a miracle at his feet. Before Harrison could formulate another word, Admiral Robert Sterling shifted on the gurney. His hands, pale and stained with blood, twitched against the sheets. His eyelids flickered heavily under the harsh beam of Marcus's flashlight, struggling against the residual shock and hypoxia. "Sir?" Commander Marcus said instantly, leaning over the gurney. "Admiral Sterling? Can you hear me, sir? We're in the elevator at Mercy General. You're safe." The Admiral's eyes slowly opened. They were cloudy, bloodshot, and unfocused at first, tracking the dim amber light on the ceiling before drifting toward the white beam of the flashlight. He let out a low, raspy groan from deep within his throat. I stepped closer, placing 2 fingers gently over his radial artery to monitor his pulse strength directly. "Take it easy, Admiral," I said softly, my voice calm and grounded. "Don't try to move. You've had a severe cardiac event, but your pressure is holding." At the sound of my voice, the Admiral's head turned slightly on the pillow. His pale blue eyes locked onto my face. For a long, tense second, the only sound in the elevator was the steady beep, beep, beep of the cardiac monitor and the hum of the emergency light. The cloudiness in the Admiral's eyes suddenly cleared. A sharp, unmistakable spark of deep, ancient recognition flared within his gaze as he stared at my features, my dark hair, and the calm, unwavering posture I held in the penumbra of the flashlight. His hand, weak and trembling, lifted an inch off the blood-stained sheet. His fingers reached out, blindly searching until they brushed against the sleeve of my dark blue paramedic uniform. His lips parted, dry and cracked, struggling to form words through the haze of near death. "Doc," the Admiral rasped out, his voice barely a whisper, but every single person in that small steel box heard it with terrifying clarity. "Doc. Phoenix." Harrison frowned, stepping closer in confusion. "What is he saying? Is he delirious? Who is Phoenix?" I felt a sudden icy shockwave run down my spine, but my face remained an absolute unreadable mask of stone. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. Commander Marcus's head snapped toward me, his sharp eyes narrowing into slits as he looked from the Admiral's clutching fingers to my face, realizing instantly that the 4-star Admiral of the United States Navy hadn't just spoken a random word. He had called me by a classified military call sign. Commander Marcus's eyes remained locked on my face, sharp and probing as a laser beam, while the steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor echoed inside the cramped steel confines of the stalled elevator. "Phoenix," Commander Marcus repeated softly, his voice barely audible above the low hum of the emergency light panel. That was the call sign of the chief trauma specialist attached to SEAL Team 6 during Operation Shadowgate in 2021, the surgeon who pulled 12 wounded operators out of a burning compound in Kandahar. Harrison scoffed, adjusting his crumpled lab coat as he leaned against the wall, trying desperately to rebuild his shattered composure. "Don't be ridiculous, Commander," Harrison interjected, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and forced superiority. "She's an entry-level paramedic for Norfolk EMS. She drives a rig and carries a flashlight. She probably picked up some military jargon from listening to old veterans in the triage lobby. The Admiral is hypoxic, delirious, and suffering from severe cerebral ischemia. He's babbling nonsense." I didn't answer Harrison. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were fixed on Admiral Sterling's vital signs. My gloved fingers rested firmly over his radial artery, feeling the steady, strong 62 beats per minute pounding against my latex glove. His blood pressure is holding at 112/72. I reported calmly to the nurse, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Keep the IV saline flowing at a wide-open rate. Do not let his mean arterial pressure drop below 65. "Understood, Nora," the nurse replied, her hands no longer trembling as she adjusted the infusion clamp. Commander Marcus took a slow step closer to me, his heavy tactical vest brushing against my arm in the tight space. He looked down at the blood-stained 14-gauge spinal needles secured to the Admiral's chest with surgical tape, then back at my face. "I served under Admiral Sterling at the Pentagon 2 years ago," Marcus said quietly, his gaze unyielding. "I read the classified debriefs from Kandahar. Captain Clara Phoenix Vance was reported missing in action, her file sealed at the highest clearance level after a command structure failure. They said she abandoned her post." He paused, looking at my worn combat boots, my dark navy paramedic uniform, and the cold, absolute precision of my hands. "They lied," Marcus whispered, a look of profound, sudden understanding dawning across his weathered features. "You didn't abandon anyone. They buried you." "My name is Nora Blake, Commander," I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. "And right now, my only rank is the person holding this man's life together until your extraction team gets these doors open." Before Marcus could respond, a violent, deafening screech of grinding metal shuddered through the elevator shaft overhead. Creak! Bang! Dust and tiny paint chips rained down from the emergency escape hatch on the ceiling. The heavy mechanical thud of pneumatic rescue equipment vibrated through the steel walls of the carriage. "Elevator 3, do you copy?" A loud voice boomed from the 5th floor landing through the crack in the outer doors. "This is Norfolk Fire and Rescue Heavy Squad 4. We have heavy hydraulic spreaders on the outer doors. Stand clear of the threshold." "We copy, Heavy Squad," Commander Marcus yelled back, stepping back to shield the gurney with his body. "Patient is stabilized but critical. We have a 4-star Admiral with open chest trauma. Get us out of here." A second later, the high-pitched whine of a hydraulic cutter tore through the silence. Bright orange sparks rained down through the narrow seam between the double steel doors. The metal groaned under thousands of pounds of pressure as the jaws of life bit into the outer frame. With a massive, explosive pop, the heavy outer doors of the 5th floor shaft were forced apart, revealing the brightly lit hallway of the cardiology wing. 4 firefighters in heavy yellow turnouts peered into the dim, blood-slicked carriage, their eyes widening in shock at the scene inside. 2 armed Navy SEALs, a 4-star Admiral covered in blood on a gurney, a trembling ER director backed against the wall, and a female paramedic standing over the patient with a spinal needle taped directly into his chest cavity. "Holy hell," the lead firefighter muttered, snapping his visor up. "Secure the carriage. Lock the safety dogs onto the guide rails." 2 firefighters slid heavy steel locking chocks beneath the elevator floor, securing the cab against any further freefall. "Let's move! Now!" Commander Marcus commanded. The 2 SEALs immediately grabbed the handles of the heavy tactical gurney. Together with the firefighters, they hoisted the bed seamlessly across the 6-inch gap between the suspended elevator floor and the 5th floor concrete landing. Harrison didn't wait for anyone else. He scrambled out of the elevator cab like a frightened animal, tripping over his own trousers before catching himself on the hallway wall. The moment his feet touched the solid floor of the corridor, his timid demeanor vanished, replaced instantly by the desperate, scheming ambition that defined his entire career. "Clear the corridor!" Harrison roared at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing down the hallway as if he had been in complete command the entire time. "I need an open path to the service elevators for OR Suite 1. Page Chief Anesthesiologist Miller immediately. Tell him, Doctor, Harrison Vance is bringing in a 4-star Admiral with severe thoracic trauma." Nurses and technicians in green scrubs rushed out of nearby patient rooms, staring in awe as Harrison marched ahead of the gurney, waving his arms dramatically, shouting orders to everyone within earshot. "Prepare the cell saver," Harrison yelled, stepping into the service elevator ahead of the team, his face flushed with unearned pride. "I executed an emergency stabilization in the shaft. The patient has a fragile pulse. I will be performing the primary thoracotomy." I walked quietly beside the gurney, holding the primary IV line elevated, while my partner, Leo, who had just run up the emergency stairwell after hearing the breach, fell into step beside me, his eyes wide with shock. "Nora!" Leo gasped, looking at the blood covering my hands and sleeves. "What happened down there? The whole hospital is talking about the elevator dropping." "The elevator broke, Leo," I said softly, keeping my eyes on Admiral Sterling's monitor. "The Admiral is stable for now. We reached the 8th floor surgical suite concourse. The wide waiting area outside operating suite 1 was packed. Word of the crisis had spread like wildfire. Standing near the glass doors was the chief executive officer of Mercy General Hospital, 3 corporate board members in dark business suits, 2 local news cameras flashing bright LED lights, and a crowd of high-ranking Navy officers. The moment the double doors opened and the gurney was wheeled into the concourse, the cameras flashed blinding white light. Harrison stepped directly into the center of the crowd, puffing his chest out, his hands raised in a gesture of triumphant authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," Harrison announced loudly, his voice projecting across the concourse, ensuring the news microphones picked up every word. "As Surgical Director of Mercy General, I am pleased to report that through aggressive, high-risk surgical intervention conducted under extreme conditions inside the stalled elevator, I have successfully stabilized Admiral Robert Sterling." The hospital CEO smiled broadly, stepping forward to clap Harrison on the shoulder in front of the flashing cameras. "Brilliant work, Dr. Vance," the CEO declared loudly. "A true testament to the world-class surgical leadership here at Mercy General." Harrison smiled, soaking in the applause and the flashing camera lights, nodding with practiced humility. "Thank you, sir. It was a terrifying scenario. Complete power failure, freefall drop, cardiac arrest in the dark. But my training kicked in. I performed an emergency thoracic relief procedure on the floor of the elevator, restoring his pulse before the extraction team breached the doors." Leo stared at Harrison in absolute speechless horror. Is he serious?" Leo whispered aggressively, turning to me, his voice trembling with outrage. "He hid in the corner and whimpered while you saved that man's life with a spinal needle." "He's taking credit for your work." I didn't answer. I stood 10 feet back in the shadow of the hallway archway, holding my heavy trauma bag, my face calm and unbothered. I had seen men like Harrison before in Washington and in field command. Men who craved medals they never earned, and speeches for battles they never fought. My concern wasn't the applause in the lobby. My concern was the man being wheeled through the double doors of Operating Suite 1. "Let him talk, Leo," I said softly, my voice completely steady. "A lie travels fast, but it can't survive under a surgical lamp." As the surgical team pushed Admiral Sterling into the sterile prep room, Commander Marcus stopped in the doorway. He looked at Harrison standing in front of the flashing cameras, a look of utter disgust crossing the commander's face. Then, Commander Marcus turned around and walked directly past the reporters, past the hospital executives, and stopped right in front of me in the quiet shadow of the corridor. The 2 Navy SEALs who had been inside the elevator stood at attention behind him. Without saying a word, Commander Marcus reached into his tactical vest pocket. He pulled out a heavy silver object wrapped in a velvet cloth, a 4-star Admiral's personal military challenge coin, bearing the engraved seal of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the crest of Navy Special Warfare. Marcus took my right hand, the hand that had guided the needle into the Admiral's chest in the dark, and placed the heavy silver coin firmly into my palm, folding my fingers over it. "Admiral Sterling slipped this into my hand before we loaded him onto the gurney," Marcus said quietly, his eyes fixed on mine with unshakable respect. "He told me to give it to the surgeon who saved his life." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a low, firm whisper that only I could hear. "Harrison Vance can talk to the cameras all he wants tonight, Captain," Marcus said, "but the Navy knows who was in the dark. And when Admiral Sterling wakes up in that ICU tomorrow morning, there isn't a lie in this hospital big enough to save that fake doctor from what's coming." The heavy, soundproof double doors of Operating Suite 1 swung closed, cutting off the blinding flashbulbs of the news cameras and the eager applause of the hospital board members in the concourse. Through the wide observation window of the gallery above, I watched Dr. Harrison Vance step into the sterile operating theater, surrounded by an elite team of scrub nurses, circulating technicians, and senior cardiothoracic fellows. Harrison moved around the operating table with an exaggerated theatrical flourish, shouting orders to Chief Anesthesiologist Dr. Miller to prepare the thoracic tray and initiate bypass protocols. But the second doctor, Miller, pulled back the sterile drapes and prepped Admiral Sterling's chest. The anesthesiologist paused, leaning closer over the bed with a look of intense clinical confusion. "Dr. Vance," Dr. Miller said, pointing his gloved hand directly at the subxiphoid region just below the Admiral's breastbone. "The pericardial effusion has already been completely evacuated. Look at the central arterial monitor. There's 0 tamponade remaining, and the arterial tear has been stabilized with a precision subxiphoid catheter lock. Who placed this 14-gauge spinal line? Harrison flushed a dark, guilty red behind his surgical mask. His eyes darted nervously toward the observation gallery, where Commander Marcus and 2 armed Navy SEALs stood watching his every move through the glass like hawks. I performed a rapid needle decompression during the elevator descent. Harrison lied smoothly, his voice muffled by the mask as he tried to regain his composure. It was an emergency maneuver under blackout conditions. Now hand me the sternal saw so I can open the chest and inspect the site. Doctor. Miller looked down at Harrison's manicured, trembling hands, then back at the microscopic, flawless placement of the spinal catheter. A entry angle so precise it missed the left anterior descending artery by less than 2 millimeters. You placed a 14-gauge needle into a fluid-choked pericardial sac in complete darkness while suspended in a free-fallen elevator cab? Dr. Miller asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Harrison, this is a specialized combat procedure taught exclusively in Navy Special Operations trauma courses. You've never performed a blind pericardiocentesis in your entire life. Are you questioning my surgical competence in my own operating room, Miller? Harrison snapped, his voice rising in high-pitched panic. I stabilized the Admiral in that shaft. Now prep the cell saver and let me work. I turned away from the observation window, unbuttoning the top snaps of my dark blue paramedic jacket. I didn't need to stay and watch Harrison pretend to be a hero. The Admiral's vital signs were rock solid. His pericardial pressure was 0, and the actual vascular repair work inside the chest would be executed by the brilliant cardiothoracic fellows who actually possessed the skill to close the vessel. My work in the shaft was done. Come on, Nora, Leo whispered, walking beside me as we headed down the quiet service stairwell toward the first-floor EMS report lounge. The shift is almost over. You need to wash that arterial blood off your arms. Downstairs in the paramedic lounge, the air was quiet and smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. I stood at the deep stainless steel sink, scrubbing the dried blood from my fingers, wrists, and forearms with harsh iodine soap. My hands were steady, my mind completely focused. In my right trouser pocket, the heavy, cold weight of Admiral Sterling's silver challenge coin pressed against my thigh. A quiet, unyielding anchor of truth. Leo sat at the corner desk, staring at the wall-mounted television screen showing the local news broadcast. On the screen, Harrison was smiling broadly beside the hospital CEO, nodding humbly as the news anchor praised his heroic surgical intervention in the stalled elevator. Look at him, Leo spat, slamming his fist onto the desk in anger. He's on live television taking full credit for what you did. He hid in the corner like a terrified child while you brought a dead admiral back to life with a needle. How can you just stand there and stay quiet, Nora? A lie is a fragile thing, Leo, I said softly, rinsing the brown iodine foam from my hands under the warm water. It requires constant maintenance and protection. The truth doesn't need anyone to shout for it. It just sits there waiting. Before Leo could reply, the heavy door of the paramedic lounge burst open, slamming hard against the drywall. Dr. Harrison Vance marched into the room, flanked by 2 uniformed hospital security guards and Mr. Henderson, the chief administrative officer of Mercy General Hospital. Harrison had stripped off his surgical gown, but his face was still flushed with a toxic mix of adrenaline, arrogance, and deep, festering panic. There she is, Harrison barked, pointing a finger directly at my face. Escort her off the premises immediately. Leo stood up from his desk instantly, stepping between the guards and me. Whoa! What the hell is going on here? Leo demanded. You can't just throw us out. We're finishing our official shift run logs. She is no longer permitted on hospital grounds, Harrison declared loudly, stepping closer, his voice dripping with venom. Paramedic Blake engaged in gross medical malpractice, insubordination, and unauthorized practice of medicine during the transport of Admiral Sterling. She illegally interfered with an active surgical case and endangered a high-ranking military official. You lying coward, Leo yelled, his face turning red with outrage. She saved his life while you were cowering on the floor in the dark. I saw the blood on her hands. Silence, Mr. Henderson, the CAO, interjected sternly, raising a hand. Dr. Vance is the surgical director of this facility. His official incident report states that Paramedic Blake panicked during the elevator failure. attempted an unauthorized invasive procedure, and had to be physically restrained by Dr. Vance to prevent further harm. I pulled a paper towel from the dispenser, dried my hands with slow, deliberate care, and turned around to face them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show an ounce of anger. I simply looked Harrison dead in the eye, observing the subtle, nervous twitch beneath his left eye. "Where is the official shift report, Paramedic Blake?" Mr. Henderson asked, holding out his hand. "And hand over your digital recording tablet immediately. All records regarding the medical transport of Admiral Sterling are being impounded under hospital legal protocol. My field notes and digital telemetry sheets belong to Norfolk Emergency Medical Services, not Mercy General Hospital," I said, my voice low, flat, and completely steady. "And they have already been transmitted." Harrison's eyes widened in sudden, sharp alarm. "You did what?" "I filed an official time-stamped clinical run report at 3:42 a.m., I said, taking one slow step forward. "It includes the 14-gauge needle placement, the exact volume of pericardial blood evacuated, the telemetry data before and after the procedure, and the names of all witnesses present inside the elevator cab." "You arrogant little imposter!" Harrison shrieked, his polished facade completely shattering into rage. "Guards, seize her tablet, confiscate her equipment, and remove her from this building right now." The 2 security guards took a step toward me, reaching out to grab my arms. "Touch her, and you will be facing a federal military tribunal by sunrise." A cold, lethal voice boomed from the doorway. Everyone in the room froze. Commander Marcus stepped into the paramedic lounge, flanked by 4 armed Navy SEALs in full tactical gear. The energy in the small room shifted instantly from administrative posturing to pure military dominance. The 2 security guards backed away immediately, their hands dropping to their sides as they recognized the formidable force standing in front of them. Harrison swallowed hard, trying desperately to muster his administrative authority. "Commander Marcus, this is an internal hospital administrative matter. This paramedic committed severe medical infractions." "Shut your mouth, Harrison," Marcus said quietly, walking straight past the trembling doctor, as if he were completely invisible. Marcus stopped directly in front of me, coming to a crisp, formal military attention. "Captain Vance," Marcus said, using my real military rank loudly and clearly in front of Harrison, Henderson, the security guards, and a wide-eyed Leo. "Admiral Robert Sterling has just cleared the post-op recovery unit and has been transferred to the intensive care unit on the 6th floor. He has regained full consciousness." Harrison's face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. "See Captain Vance," Harrison stammered, his voice squeaking in utter horror. What are you talking about? She's a paramedic." Commander Marcus ignored Harrison entirely, pulling an official blue velvet folder from beneath his arm. "By direct executive order of the Secretary of the Navy and the Joint Chiefs of Staff," Marcus announced, opening the folder, "Mercy General Hospital's medical jurisdiction over Admiral Sterling's care has been officially revoked. Full medical oversight has been transferred to Navy Special Warfare Command." Marcus pulled a gold-embossed military clearance badge from the folder and handed it directly to me. "Admiral Sterling is requesting his primary surgeon at his bedside immediately," Marcus said, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "He refused to speak to the hospital board, the CEO, or the press until Captain Clara Vance presents his case." Mr. Henderson stared at me in absolute, speechless horror, realizing the monumental legal, ethical, and political catastrophe Harrison had dragged the entire hospital into. Harrison took a trembling step back, his hands shaking violently as he looked at the gold clearance badge resting in my hands. No. This is a mistake. I conducted the stabilization. I am the surgical director." I tucked the military clearance badge into my uniform pocket, picked up my trauma bag, and looked at Harrison one last time. "Your lie lasted exactly 2 hours, Harrison," I said softly, stepping past him toward the door. "Now let me take you to the ICU so you can explain your surgical report to the Admiral." The elevator doors opened onto the 6th floor, and the intense, quiet atmosphere of the intensive care unit felt like a world apart from the chaotic lobby downstairs. Armed Navy SEALs lined the corridor at 10-foot intervals, their tactical gear imposing and unyielding against the sterile white walls. Every civilian staff member who passed through was subjected to strict security checks. But when Commander Marcus led me down the hall, The armed guard snapped to attention without hesitation. Behind us trailed Dr. Harrison Vance and Mr. Henderson, the chief administrative officer. Harrison was practically sweating through his clothes, his face pale and his hands fidgeting nervously as he tried to maintain an air of professional importance. "Commander, I must insist that I present the clinical status report first," Harrison said, his voice strained and unnaturally high. "As the surgical director who oversaw the emergency stabilization, it is my professional duty to debrief the Admiral on his post-operative prognosis." Commander Marcus didn't even turn around. "The Admiral gave specific orders, Doctor. You'll speak when you're spoken to." We stopped outside room 604. Through the large glass window, I could see Admiral Robert Sterling lying in the specialized ICU bed. He was hooked up to advanced telemetry monitors, a crisp white sheet drawn over his chest where a clean thoracic dressing was now secured. His cardiac rhythm was a steady, strong 64 beats per minute, and his skin had recovered its natural color. Commander Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside, holding it for me. I stepped into the quiet room, my heavy paramedic trauma bag slung over my shoulder, my Navy uniform still bearing faint, dried watermarks from the night's chaos. Harrison and Henderson squeezed in behind us, looking like men walking toward a firing squad. Admiral Sterling turned his head slowly on the pillow as the door clicked shut. His eyes, clear and sharp, despite the heavy sedatives and trauma, moved past Marcus, past the hospital administrators, and locked directly onto me. A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Captain Vance," Admiral Sterling rasped out, his voice deeper and far more stable than it had been in the stalled elevator cab. "It's been a long time since Kandahar." "It has, Admiral," I replied softly, coming to a natural, respectful military posture at the foot of his bed. "You look much better than you did 2 hours ago, sir. That's because someone knew how to handle a 14-gauge spinal needle in the dark," Sterling said, his eyes crinkling with dry humor. "If memory serves, that's the second time you've kept me on this side of the dirt." Harrison cleared his throat loudly, taking an aggressive step toward the bedside, holding a thick leather chart against his chest like a shield. "Admiral Sterling, sir," Harrison interjected loudly, attempting to dominate the conversation. "I am Dr. Harrison Vance, Surgical Director of Emergency Medicine here at Mercy General. I am relieved to see you awake. As I reported to the press and your command staff earlier, the emergency procedures performed during the elevator failure were extremely complex, but my team and I managed to secure your vitals before—" "Harrison?" Admiral Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping into a quiet, icy tone that instantly cut through the room like a razor. Harrison froze, his mouth half open. "Yes, Admiral? I was conscious for 3 minutes inside that elevator before I lost awareness," Sterling said calmly, looking the doctor dead in the eye. "I remember the dark. I remember the cables snapping. And I remember a man screaming on his knees, pounding on the steel doors in a blind panic while my blood was flooding the floor." Harrison's face drained of all color. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically to Mr. Henderson, who looked as if he wanted to melt into the floorboards. "Sir, you were suffering from severe cerebral hypoxia," Harrison stammered, his voice trembling violently. "Your memories are undoubtedly confused by the trauma and the lack of oxygen." "My memory is sharp enough to remember who held my chest together, Doctor," Sterling snapped, his voice carrying the immovable weight of 40 years of naval command. "And it wasn't a man wearing a tailored suit and a gold watch." Sterling shifted slightly, reaching out his hand toward Commander Marcus. Marcus immediately handed him a dark navy blue secure digital tablet. "While you were busy giving interviews to news cameras in the concourse, Dr. Vance," Admiral Sterling continued, tapping the screen, "Commander Marcus reviewed the internal security feeds from the 4th-floor landing and the automated telemetry logs recorded by the transport gurney's hard drive." Sterling turned the screen toward Harrison and Mr. Henderson. On the high-definition display was the raw, unedited digital telemetry file transmitted from my paramedic unit at 3:42 a.m. It showed the exact second the flatline occurred, the sudden drop in pericardial pressure corresponding to the manual needle extraction, and the immediate restoration of sinus rhythm, all time-stamped minutes before the fire department breached the elevator doors. Beside the telemetry was a written statement signed by the senior ER nurse and the 2 Navy SEALs who were inside the cab, detailing Harrison's complete breakdown and my precise execution of the emergency pericardiocentesis. Your official incident report, Dr. Vance, Sterling said coldly, claims that paramedic Blake engaged in unauthorized malpractice and had to be restrained by you. But these certified logs, and my own eyes, tell a very different story. You attempted to steal credit for a life-saving military procedure performed by a decorated combat surgeon while falsifying a medical record to cover up your own cowardice. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his forehead glistening with cold sweat, his hands raised in surrender. Admiral Sterling, please understand. The hospital administration was completely unaware of these discrepancies. Dr. Vance presented his report as the attending authority. Then your administration is as incompetent as he is, Mr. Henderson, Sterling cut in sharply. Falsifying medical records regarding a 4-star admiral and attempting to destroy the career of a Navy veteran is not just a hospital ethics violation, it is a federal offense under military jurisdiction. Harrison stood paralyzed, his chart slipping from his numb fingers and slamming onto the tile floor. The grand illusions of promotions, board seats, and political glory vanished in a single instant, replaced by the terrifying reality of total professional and legal ruin. Commander Marcus, Admiral Sterling ordered, his voice unwavering. Sir, Marcus answered, stepping forward. Notify the State Medical Board and the Department of Justice, Sterling said, glaring at Harrison. I want Dr. Vance's medical license suspended immediately pending a full federal inquiry into fraud and falsification of records. Escort him off these premises and ensure he does not touch another patient or document in this facility. Understood, Admiral, Marcus said. He gestured to 2 armed SEALs standing at the door. Take him. The 2 SEALs moved in with terrifying efficiency, grabbing Harrison by his arms. Wait! Please! Admiral, listen to me! Harrison shrieked, his voice cracking as he was hauled backward toward the door. It was a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect the hospital's liability. Nora, tell them. Tell them I was trying to manage the scene. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching silently as Harrison was dragged out into the hallway, his desperate shouts echoing down the corridor before the heavy door clicked shut, sealing the room in complete, serene silence. Mr. Henderson bowed his head nervously. I will personally see to it that all administrative charges against Paramedic Blake are dropped immediately, Admiral. She will receive a full formal apology from the Board of Directors. She doesn't need your apology, Henderson, Sterling said flatly. She needs you to leave this room so she can finish her report. Henderson nodded frantically and backed out of the room like a defeated man, closing the door behind him. Only Admiral Sterling, Commander Marcus, and I remained in the quiet ICU suite. The steady, soothing beat of the cardiac monitor filled the air. Admiral Sterling looked at me, the harshness fading from his features, replaced by a deep, weary respect. He looked at the silver challenge coin resting in my palm. I know why you left the Navy 3 years ago, Clara, Sterling said quietly. I know about the tribunal in Washington, and I know how the bureaucracy threw you under the bus after Kandahar to protect higher-ranked officers who made bad calls. I took a quiet breath, my face calm. I chose to leave, sir. I just wanted to save lives without the politics. And you've been doing that on the streets of Norfolk, Sterling said, a proud smile touching his lips. But today proved something, Clara. You can hide under a paramedic uniform all you want. But a true surgeon's hands can't stay hidden when lives are on the line. He paused, looking at Commander Marcus, then back at me. The Pentagon cleared your record 6 months ago, Captain, Sterling revealed softly, his words striking my chest like a physical weight. The full investigation into Shadowgate was reopened, and your actions in Kandahar were fully vindicated. The Joint Chiefs have been looking for you ever since. My heart gave a sharp, unexpected thud against my ribs. I stared at the Admiral, speechless for the first time all night. Your commission as a captain in the United States Navy Medical Corps has been fully restored, Admiral Sterling announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. And as Commander of Navy Special Warfare, I am officially offering you the position of Chief of Trauma Medicine at the Naval Medical Center. He looked at me, waiting for my response as the weight of my past and my future collided in the quiet room. The silence inside room 604 felt profound and absolute. broken only by the steady, rhythmic chirping of Admiral Sterling's cardiac monitor. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of 3 years of voluntary exile. Chief of Trauma Medicine at the Naval Medical Center. I stood completely motionless at the foot of his bed, my dark blue paramedic uniform suddenly feeling like a suit of armor I had outgrown. The cold, heavy metal of the Admiral's silver challenge coin was pressed firmly into the palm of my right hand, its sharp ridges leaving a deep, familiar impression against my skin. For 3 long, quiet years, I had convinced myself that I belonged in the shadow of Norfolk's streets. I had told myself that driving an ambulance through rain-slicked avenues at 3 a.m, answering frantic emergency calls, and handing patients over at hospital doors was the only way I could continue saving lives without being destroyed by the toxic politics, backstabbing ambition, and corrupt military command structures that had buried my reputation after Operation Shadowgate in Kandahar. I had actively sought anonymity, intentionally turning my back on the high-tech surgical suites where I had once performed clinical miracles under heavy artillery fire. "I don't expect an immediate binding answer from you tonight, Clara," Admiral Sterling said softly, his deep voice cutting through the thick quiet of the room. "You've spent 3 years hiding in plain sight, carefully building a quiet, solitary life out of the wreckage left behind by corrupt men in Washington. You earned that peace, and I respect it completely." He leaned back against his crisp white pillows, his pale blue eyes studying my face with a deep, paternal understanding born of shared combat experience. "But a storm is coming across the global horizon," Sterling continued, his tone turning solemn, grave, and absolute. "Our young field medics, Navy special warfare operators, and surgical residents need someone who knows how to keep their head when everything falls apart in the dark. They need a chief who leads by clinical mastery, courage, and unyielding moral integrity, not by administrative titles and tailored coats. Your country needs Captain Clara Vance back at the helm of naval medicine." Commander Marcus took a step forward, his expression grave and deeply respectful as he held a thick leather briefing folder. "The Joint Chiefs of Staff have already signed off on the full reinstatement papers, Captain. The official press release clearing your name completely from the events in Kandahar is queued to be issued to the national news outlets tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp, right after the hospital's formal emergency board assembly. Take the rest of the night," Sterling added, closing his eyes slightly as the potent post-operative sedatives began to take hold again. "Think about where your hands truly belong. But whatever you decide, thank you for keeping me on this side of the dirt tonight, Doc. Get some rest, Admiral," I said quietly, coming to a crisp, instinctive military attention for the first time in 3 years, raising my right hand in a sharp, flawless salute. Sterling offered a faint, proud nod, and Commander Marcus opened the heavy ICU door for me. I stepped out into the 6th-floor corridor, my combat boots making soft, rhythmic sounds against the polished floor. The hospital was beginning to wake up as dawn approached, soft gray light filtering through the high glass windows at the end of the hallway. I felt a strange, profound lightness in my chest, as if a heavy iron chain that had bound my lungs for 3 years had finally snapped. When I reached the ambulance bay on the ground floor, the cold morning air hit my face like a splash of ice water. The heavy humidity of the night had dissipated, replaced by a crisp, clear ocean breeze blowing off the Norfolk harbor. Standing near the open back doors of our ambulance rig, holding 2 steaming paper cups of hot coffee, was my partner, Leo Miller. He looked utterly exhausted, his dark blue uniform rumpled and stained, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw me walk out through the sliding glass doors. He walked over and handed me one of the cups, the steam rising into the chilly morning air. "You're famous, Nora," Leo said, offering a tired but warm, genuine smile. Or should I say, "Captain Vance?" I took a slow sip of the black coffee, looking at my young partner. "You heard? Commander Marcus filled me in while you were up in the ICU," Leo said, his tone turning serious and filled with an almost reverent respect. "He told me about Kandahar. He told me how you pulled 12 wounded SEAL operators out of a burning, crumbling compound under heavy mortar fire. Nora, why didn't you ever tell me about your past? Because when I arrived in Norfolk 3 years ago, Nora Blake was all I had left," I answered softly, looking out across the rain-slicked asphalt of the parking lot toward the harbor ships. "I thought if I put away the surgeon's mask, the scalpels, and the military rank. I could leave the pain and betrayal behind. I wanted to serve without being target practice for military politics. Leo shook his head, looking down at his own gloved hands, then directly up into my eyes. When Dr. Vance tried to humiliate you in Trauma Bay 2 tonight, you didn't yell. You didn't pull rank. You just saved that young veteran's life on the gurney. And then, when that elevator dropped into pitch darkness and the doctor panicked, you stepped up and performed a miracle with a 14-gauge needle. He paused, taking a deep, resolute breath. You're a great paramedic, Nora. The best partner I could ever ask for on these streets. But you're not meant to be driving this ambulance forever. You belong in an operating room, saving lives on the biggest stage there is. If the Navy is giving you back what was stolen from you, you have to take it. You can't let them keep you in the dark. Norfolk EMS will survive, but those young Navy surgeons need you. I looked at Leo, deeply touched by the genuine, unselfish pride shining in his eyes. I'm going to miss having you on my 6, Miller. Hey, Leo grinned, punching my shoulder lightly in a playful gesture. Maybe when you're chief of trauma medicine at the Naval Medical Center, you can hire a promising young paramedic as your chief surgical assistant. We shared a quiet, warm laugh as the sun began to break over the horizon, casting long golden light rays across the hospital towers and the calm waters of the bay. I spent the next 2 hours walking alone along the quiet waterfront park near the medical center. The cool morning wind blew through my hair as I watched the massive naval warships anchored in the bay, their gray steel hulls reflecting the rising sun. I thought about the long, painful journey that had brought me to this exact moment. From the blood-stained, dusty triage tents of Kandahar to the dark, plunging elevator shaft of Mercy General Hospital. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight of silence I had carried for 3 whole years, believing that my surgical skills were a curse and that justice would never arrive. But I also realized that every single life I had saved on the streets of Norfolk had kept my hands ready and my heart true for this exact test. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out the silver challenge coin. I held it up to the brilliant morning light, tracing the raised letters of the Joint Chiefs of Staff seal and the Navy Special Warfare crest with my thumb. The cold silver felt warm under the morning sun. For 3 long years, I had let fear, anger, and the bitterness of administrative betrayal define my existence. I had intentionally hidden my God-given talent to protect myself from ever being hurt again by a broken, selfish system. But tonight had proven something undeniable to my soul. No matter how deep you bury the light, true purpose always finds a way to break through the dark. I wasn't Nora Blake, the quiet, hiding paramedic anymore. I was Clara Vance, a decorated combat surgeon forged in the fires of war, and it was time to step back onto the battlefield to lead the next generation. At precisely 7:45 a.m., I walked back through the front glass doors of the main administrative building at Mercy General Hospital. The grand auditorium on the 2nd floor was packed to absolute maximum capacity. Over 200 hospital staff members, department chiefs, board directors, local news reporters, and high-ranking military officers filled the rows of plush seats. At the front of the stage sat the chief executive officer, Mr. Henderson, and the members of the board of directors, looking pale, terrified, and deeply anxious about the impending fallout. In the back row, guarded by 2 armed military police officers, sat Dr. Harrison Vance in heavy steel handcuffs, his head bowed in complete, soul-crushing humiliation as he awaited his formal transfer into federal military custody. I walked down the central aisle toward the stage, wearing my dark navy uniform, my head held high, my posture erect, and my stride firm and unshakable. Every single head in the room turned to watch me pass in stunned, reverent silence. Commander Marcus stood near the main podium, holding a wireless microphone. Beside him, leaning slightly on a carved wooden cane, with a crisp new dress uniform coat resting over his shoulders, was Admiral Robert Sterling. The room fell into an absolute breathless hush as Admiral Sterling stepped up to the podium, his clear blue eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd before locking directly onto me as I reached the front row. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Sterling's powerful voice echoed through the auditorium's loudspeakers, commanding immediate, unquestioned authority. We are gathered here today to set the record straight, once and for all. Admiral Sterling stood erect behind the heavy mahogany podium at the front of the grand auditorium, his posture unyielding despite his recent thoracic surgery. His physical presence dominated the massive room. The muffled hum of whispered conversations and camera adjustments died down instantly as his sharp, pale blue eyes cut across the rows of reporters, hospital board directors, department heads, and armed military personnel. 4 hours ago, inside a stalled, free-fallen elevator shaft beneath this very building, Sterling announced into the microphone, his deep, resonant voice booming through the auditorium's surround sound speakers with absolute razor-sharp clarity. A high-risk, life-saving surgical procedure was executed under pitch-black conditions. A procedure that saved my life after my heart flatlined in complete, profound cardiac arrest. A quiet, dramatic rustle went through the auditorium as news camera operators quickly zoomed in on the Admiral's decorated uniform and the crisp white collar rising above his chest dressing. In the very back row, guarded by 2 stoic Navy SEALs, Dr. Harrison Vance shifted uncomfortably in his heavy steel handcuffs. Cold sweat poured down Harrison's pale forehead, soaking his pristine shirt collar as he stared at the floor, shivering under the bright fluorescent lights. Earlier this morning, Sterling continued, his gaze narrowing as he looked directly at the hospital board, this institution's senior executive leadership presented a polished narrative to the press and the public. A story claiming that Dr. Harrison Vance, surgical director of emergency medicine, conducted that heroic, high-risk intervention. I am standing before you today to state, unequivocally, that Dr. Vance's claims are an absolute self-serving fabrication, a fraudulent attempt to steal the heroic actions of a decorated combat veteran. A collective, audible gasp echoed across the vast auditorium. Several corporate board members sat up straight, their faces draining of all color as television camera crews pivoted abruptly toward the back row, capturing high-definition footage of Harrison sitting in handcuffs. Dr. Vance did not perform a surgery, Sterling declared, his voice carrying 40 years of unshakable naval authority. When the elevator dropped and the main power cut out, Dr. Vance lost control, abandoned his patient, and cowered against the wall in a blind panic. The individual who stepped forward without a second of hesitation guided a 14-gauge needle into my fluid-choked pericardial sac in complete darkness, and restored my pulse was an emergency paramedic from Norfolk EMS. Sterling paused, turning his head slowly toward the side aisle where I stood in my dark blue paramedic uniform alongside Commander Marcus and my partner, Leo Miller. That paramedic's legal name is Nora Blake, Sterling said, his voice softening with a profound, quiet emotion. Or rather, Captain Clara Phoenix Vance of the United States Navy Medical Corps. The auditorium erupted into an absolute frenzy of loud murmurs, excited whispers, and blinding camera flashes. Mr. Henderson, the chief executive officer of Mercy General Hospital, slowly lowered his face into his trembling hands at the front table, realizing the monumental legal and reputational disaster that had just crushed his career. 3 years ago, Sterling continued, addressing the national news microphones directly, Captain Vance was wrongfully targeted by corrupt administrative politics following a classified military incident in Kandahar. Today, after a comprehensive federal review conducted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I am proud to formally announce that Captain Clara Vance has been fully exonerated of all past allegations. Her official military record has been restored to pristine status, and her commission as a captain in the Navy Medical Corps is officially reinstated. Admiral Sterling motioned with his hand for me to step up onto the stage. I walked up the carpeted stairs with a steady, unhurried, and deliberate stride, wearing my worn paramedic boots and Navy uniform like a badge of quiet honor. Commander Marcus adjusted the microphone height as I stood beside the Admiral at the center of the stage. In light of these catastrophic ethical failures, Sterling announced, glaring at the trembling board of directors, the Department of the Navy has officially revoked Mercy General Hospital's trauma certification, pending a full federal investigation into medical record falsification, obstruction, and administrative corruption. Furthermore, by direct executive order of the Secretary of the Navy, Captain Clara Vance has been appointed Chief of Trauma Medicine at the Naval Medical Center. The entire auditorium broke into thunderous, overwhelming applause. The armed Navy SEALs and uniformed military officers standing along the perimeter of the room stood at attention, clapping with firm, unwavering respect. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at the sea of flashing cameras, eager reporters, and stunned hospital staff. In the back row, Harrison slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine. In his face, I saw the complete, irreversible collapse of his world. His prestige, his board seats, his medical license, and his freedom stripped away forever, replaced by federal indictments and impending prison time. 3 years ago, when I left active duty, I believed my path as a surgeon had come to an end. I said into the microphone, my voice calm, grounded, and echoing clearly across the room. I came to Norfolk to serve quietly on an ambulance rig, believing that driving through the dark at 3 a.m. was the only way I could save lives without being destroyed by political ambition. But last night proved an eternal truth. Real medicine isn't performed for cameras, titles, or applause. It is performed in the dark, when nobody is watching, for the person lying on the gurney. I looked across the stage toward Leo Miller, who stood by the wing doors with tears of pride welling in his eyes. To my partner, Leo Miller, and the brave paramedics of Norfolk EMS, I continued softly, thank you for reminding me what true, selfless dedication looks like every single night on the streets. You showed me that real heroism wears worn boots and carries a flashlight, not a tailored lab coat. And to those who choose to lie, manipulate, and exploit others for personal glory, remember that no matter how elaborate the lie, a surgical lamp always reveals the truth. The room erupted into another wave of thunderous applause as news reporters shouted questions. But Commander Marcus stepped in, escorting me off the stage as military police officers moved in to officially take Harrison Vance into federal custody. As Harrison was led away in chains, he looked back at me one last time. But I didn't feel anger or bitterness, only a quiet, profound sense of justice finally being served. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the golden sunlight washed over the pristine waterfront grounds of the Naval Medical Center across the harbor. The crisp ocean breeze carried the clean smell of salt air and blooming coastal trees. I stood on the wide balcony of the Chief of Trauma's newly prepared office on the 5th floor, wearing a tailored navy blue service dress uniform with golden captain's eagles pinned sharply to my collar. In my coat pocket rested my official command clearance credentials, while my right hand held the heavy silver challenge coin Admiral Sterling had placed in my palm inside the stalled elevator. A soft, respectful knock sounded at the heavy oak door. "Come in," I called out, turning around. Leo Miller stepped into the spacious office, looking sharp in a new uniform as the newly appointed Chief Civilian Paramedic Liaison for the Regional Military Trauma Network. He looked around the impressive office, taking in the framed medical diplomas, tactical theater maps, and state-of-the-art diagnostic telemetry arrays mounted on the wall. "Not a bad view from the chief's balcony, Captain," Leo grinned, walking over to join me at the railing, holding 2 paper cups of black coffee. "It's a heavy responsibility, Leo," I said softly, taking one of the cups and looking out at the massive naval warships docked peacefully in the harbor basin. "We have a massive job ahead of us, rebuilding trauma protocols, training our young field medics, and ensuring that no resident or surgeon under my command is ever sacrificed for administrative politics. If anyone can do it, Clara, it's you," Leo said with deep, unshakable confidence. "By the way, Commander Marcus just informed me that the Department of Justice has formally filed charges against Harrison Vance. Fraud, falsification of federal medical documents, gross negligence, and obstruction. His medical license was permanently revoked an hour ago. He won't ever step inside an operating room again. He'll be spending the next several years in a federal facility. Harrison chose his own path," I replied quietly, looking down at the silver coin held firmly in my hand. "He spent his entire career chasing status instead of mastering his craft. When the crisis came, his vanity couldn't save him from the dark." "And what about Mr. Henderson and the hospital board?" Leo asked. "The board resigned this morning," I answered, "and Henderson is facing a full federal audit for covering up Harrison's past infractions. Mercy General is under temporary military oversight." Leo smiled warmly, raising his paper coffee cup in a quiet toast. To Captain Clara Vance, the surgeon who knows how to operate in the dark. I brought my silver challenge coin up, clinking it gently against his coffee cup. To keeping people on this side of the dirt. A deep sense of profound, unbroken peace settled into my chest. The heavy ghosts of Kandahar and the years of hiding in the shadows were finally gone, burned away by the light of truth. I was no longer running from my calling or hiding behind a pseudonym. I was Captain Clara Vance, Chief of Trauma Medicine, a combat surgeon forged in the fires of war, and my true work was just beginning.